I mean, and actually, and I really, appreciate a lot of what I heard, because I'm one of those human beings. I'm constantly striving to learn and grow and adapt and understand, right, and then hopefully evolve. So, there is that important evolution of, oppressive dynamics here within this country, and the evolution of law enforcement. And so I appreciate you laying that context about how we got here, right? Because that's valid. And the reality is the generational trauma that comes along with that, right? And so when you talked about that relationship, with Pastor Sean, that very aware of that, as my Pastor Sean was the one that introduced me, to you, and started our dialogue and in our engagement. And so with that, I've taken many opportunities to share things with you from an impacted person perspective, right, a justice involved perspective. And so as we're talking and kind of unpacking, what's the message and stuff, it's people are done with this. The reality is we are tired of not only the generational stuff that's occurred up to date, but what's currently happening today, and all of this coming together. Right? And the fact that Black and brown people, indigenous cultures, not necessarily, not all of us necessarily indigenous to this land, right? But now we are, right? Now we're here. The fact that we have historically and still today are being treated as less than human, less than deserving. The evidence across the board from and really the truth of the matter is that one of the first data looks that I got at not use of force, but engagements with law enforcement was implemented by you. In the conversation that you came to me and said, hey, we need to do this. I need to make sure that this continues to move forward. And so there's that relationship piece, right, and the value in that, and the reality that even with that relational piece, there's still that historic and current trauma, right, and the impact of that. So when we're talking about the message, right, that's some of the messages. Like, hey, it's great. God, thank you for being in a relationship with me where we can have this open discussions like we've had, about faith and common goals and common humanity. And the reality is that we're still dealing with common disproportionality. We're still dealing with common impact that is way skewed for people of color, as well as the generational and current trauma. So all of these things are coming together and coalescing underneath this political envelope that we have currently been operating in, as a species, and it's not helping. Right? So then we get all these people coming together saying, hey, we're done with this, we're tired of this, and then we hear some of this rhetoric coming across the wavelength of the nation, from the top, and it's like, wow, is it really that hard to understand why people are pissed off? Is it really that hard to grasp why thousands of people flooded the street last week and probably will again this week? It's not that far of a concept for those of us who have experienced this, right? And you talk about that disconnect, right? You talk about and the value of that, rebuilding that trust and engaging and listening and having dialogue and conversation and looking at things through a new lens. I know that one of the things that you and I have consistently talked about has been, that we see things as we are instead of as they are. And that has been one of the historic layers that has been, very challenging for our human community to really grasp that, because we're viewing you through trauma, right? We're viewing you through oppression, right? And we're viewing you, and I'm not taking you personally, but law enforcement and the justice system, the criminal justice system, and all the layers of that, through the harms that our communities have experienced over and over and over again, and the flat out lack of accountability for law enforcement officers when they're called to the task. Where is that? And that's that's the visceral, guttural sense that I get from the vibe, and that I myself experience. Fortunately, because of the personal work that I've done and I continue to do, I'm always striving to fight for a restorative lens, because I need to see, and you and I have had this, right? I finally coined it, the conversation on both sides of the badge, right? Human beings on both sides of the issue. How do we own that? How do we own the fact that, hey, you didn't cause that harm, but you're wearing a uniform that represents that, right? And the impact that that has when you show up and how you show up. So you might show up and have a bad day, and it might have absolutely nothing to do with the call that you're called out to, right? But you're just carrying a different vibe, right? And you show up in that different kind of vibe. You're not all warm and fuzzy. And yes, I really want to hear like, oh God, are you done yet? I mean, and that's natural, right? We all kind of get like that. But it has a different impact, right? And owning that, really kind of going, hey, that's where we're at as far as the human family. And we need to just start with that understanding instead of continuing to circle the drain about even getting to that understanding, because just that process within itself perpetuates the harms that we're talking about, right? It is time for us to come distinctly and succinctly and sustainably forward, come to terms with that and have forward movement in unraveling that. And so there's three things that I've come up with for myself, to help my mind kind of stay engaged in this process: reveal, remove, replace, right? The revelation of that this is what's going on, and the intentional process of removing that area, right? But empty space is still a place. So if we're not intentional about what we replace it with, it will inherently, as we've seen through structural racism and structural oppression, it will inherently strive to fill itself back in with whatever was there before. And so we must be very intentional at this stage to not only capture the opportunity to remove these dynamics that have been causing harms across the United States and really, across the planet. But let's just, try to stay home here for a minute. And be very, very aware of and engaged in that process, and then replace it with something better. And that's what I'm hearing. And that's the human cry. That's not just the cry of the people of color, because people of color have been crying about this for a long time, and rightly so. We've been wailing about it. We're angry about it. We're hurt about it, and we've survived it up to this point. But what we're also seeing too now, when you really look at this, there is a cross racial thing happening here, a cross culture thing happening. The world is watching. The world is responding, because we're done. And not just we people of color done. We've been done with it for a long time. But you're done with it too. And so how do we grasp that, lock into that, zero in on that, stand on that completeness of finishing that chapter of our human story, the story of our nation, and move forward with the call to be what we've wanted to be all this time, and really honor that for every human being, and really, really uplift the reality and hold on to that truth and make that the historical context that's talked about instead of it being swept under the rug, right? Because that's also what we've experienced. You go to school, they're not teaching. I mean, yeah, they talk about MLK and they talk about Malcolm, a little bit, but they don't talk about everybody. They don't talk. Yeah, I mean, there's no real deep dive into, what's really happened, facts on the ground to people of color in this nation, and what's currently happening. And that's also one of those things that we have just got to move forward into, making sure that if we are, and this is another one of those, and then I'll pass.
Preach it.
If you're not intentionally engaged in dismantling it, you are automatically by default perpetuating it. Period. Point blank. That's how it is. Now, are we going to move forward with that truth, or are we going to see the structural reflex to go back around and go, oh, but we don't understand? What do you mean you don't understand? You don't understand the millions of people, of black and brown people, that have been harmed and in many ways traumatized, generationally killed, indigenous. How is that a hard thing to understand? Oh, you mean you don't want to come to terms with it? That's a different thing, right? So how do we just have that common reality and go forward and really with some sustainable movement?
Yeah, and there's an after effect as well. Now you have police officers across the country that are terrified of doing their job.
Dude.
I mean,
Yep.
and there's a fear of like last week, I was driving out just getting a beverage at one of the gas stations, you know, and you see the simmering anger from folks that you're just walking in, and you have officers afraid of being accused now too of doing something maybe they didn't do. You have officers that feel like we are carrying the burden for centuries of this whole system and abuses and everything else that has happened, and we're feeling the weight of that now. And yet it's also challenged because you have emotions involved, and you have people that are afraid. When people tend to be afraid, they tend to put up those barriers.
And
you have
there's that intent versus impact, right?
Absolutely. You have the African Americans that are afraid, and now you have officers that are afraid. And this is not hyperbole. My officer is saying, I am very, very worried about doing my job now because I'm afraid that I'm going to be accused of doing something I did do, or I'm going to have to use force, and now I'm going to be demonized because the community pays us. They expect us to arrest people that don't want to go to jail. Some of those people will resist, and now I'm afraid that I'm going to be lumped in with all of that, and that's not good for the community as well. So you have these two perspectives, like you said, both sides of the badge, and that's where the conversations occur, where we can say, we're afraid that we are going to be accused of something that we didn't do, while it's the waters are being muddied over here with these people that have done these atrocities. And then you have African American community and community of color that's, we're afraid of you because you guys seem to be able to abuse us with impunity, and there doesn't seem to be recourse. And if you cannot move past that fear, then you can't have those conversations. And that's why we have good conversations. I have good conversations with my friends because we've moved past that fear, and we've been able to lower the fear. The challenge then becomes is you have to try to work through acknowledging the experiences so that fear can drop down, and then you can have those conversations. So that when an officer sees an African American walking down the street, they're like, oh, that's Steve. I know Steve. He's a good guy. His kid just graduated from high school or something like that. That's where we need to get, but you have to get there past the fear, and that's where we need to have those talks, those discussions, those meetings, you know, and we've invited community of color to speak at every single one of our post academies, and our goal is to have the recruits that we've just hired, before they even go out on the street, hear from people, hear their trauma. You haven't been out there yet. We want you to hear their experiences, and we want you to understand the emotion behind that, so that you'll understand when you're out there interacting with them, you'll understand what they've experienced or what lens they're looking through it with. But it's not just a one and done. It has to be that constant training, and it's a constant process as well. So,
yeah, and Craig if I may, I really love that, right? Because that just resonates, because that's truth, right? And there's also multiple, you know, other layers and factors and intersectionality involved with that. You know, because what we're also dealing with, so we're definitely dealing with the historical context, we're dealing with the weight, and that's one of the reasons, and it's not been the popular part of the conversation I've had with some of our impacted communities, because, you know, there's this kind of like human thing where it's so awesome to demonize and villainize people and then dehumanize them. We're like way into it, right, as a species, and all cultures are kind of dealing with that, right? So you know, that's part of the tweak that needs to happen, because while we have felt and have experienced and historically and definitively so these oppressions, these atrocities, these manifestations of dehumanizing and otherizing, what good does it do for us to respond the same way? Where does that take us? You know, and so that's like the real kind of like that's the mixing ground. That's that tension place, right? So you know, and as we've talked about so many times, it's been that restorative lens, that restorative process. Here, and I don't want to belittle that, but I don't want to get stuck there, because what I really want to zero down in on is, you know, the issue of training. You know, and you touched on that. And so when we're talking about initiative I-940 De-Escalate Washington, you know, it's really providing some context for some unprecedented stuff here in Washington State, maybe even for the nation.
Yeah.
You know, and one of those which we felt was just a great victory, but really, you know, and I'm going to articulate this for a second, so kind of try to make sure I can hold that in the parking lot, pull that back out. But you know, on the great victory. But part of the dynamic about this structural oppression, right, and the and what we call structural protectionism, is it loves to make any kind of forward movement so difficult because of the resistance and the deflection and the denial and the refusal. I can't deal with this. I can't handle it. You're too angry. You're mad at me. That it's an angry person of color again. When movement finally starts to happen, it's incremental, and it is so small compared to the inertia that has been in motion for generations, that is still in motion today, that incremental movement, however profound it might be, is still only this big to a tidal wave that is still in motion, right? So when we're dealing with these things like I-940 and the great work that was done getting us to where we're at today with the opportunity to increase training dynamics and perspectives with the new team of officers coming in, right? There's the reality that the old crew's still out there, right? That old culture's still dancing, right? And so, but one of the things I wanted to really highlight was how the training about slavery and the origins of policing. Because the reality, a decade ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, officers didn't know that. Heck, I didn't even know that. And so, so I wanted to applaud that, but also kind of highlight some of those other key points. So.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. It's incremental, and I think you have to acknowledge. This is what I feel. I want to acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do, clearly, unequivocally. And it is something that doesn't change overnight, because you're looking to change cultures, and cultures often get a four-letter word, and that's probably because we hear about the bad cultures. We don't so much hear about the good cultures as much. And it takes a while to change a culture. It's the types of people you hire, it's the type of leadership, it's the type of training, it's policies, procedures, it's discipline, it's the full gamut. One of the things that I've said, though, is we can come out with all kinds of policies. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do that. And for the most part, they will probably follow those policies. You're always going to have humans. Humans have free will. They always have the free will to decide, I'm not going to do that. And those are the ones that tend to create issues for police departments. They decide, I'm not going to follow that policy procedure. I'm not going to follow the values of SPD. But what my goal is, and it's a longer term goal, is to change the hearts of people. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier, where my goal would be to have the community, all of the community, look at the police department as we like to see. We want those people who are victimized in the community. We don't necessarily want them to be glad to see us, but we also don't want them to think that they're going to be abused or assaulted or hurt. But they shouldn't be excited to see us if they're breaking the law, right? It just shouldn't. But we also don't want people to think we're going to go in there and we're going to hurt people needlessly, that we're going to be heavy-handed. We have a job to do, and that's the goal, is to get people to see that, man, we're excited to see you, we're glad to see you. And I'm a police chief, and this is a police department for the entire city, not just whites, not just blacks, not just Asians, not just Latinos, not just Pacific Islanders. I am the chief, and we are a police department for the entire community. And the reality is if there's a burden in the community, or if there's a burden within a segment of the community, that becomes our burden, and that is something that we have to work through. We can't work through that, though, without that segment of the community working with us. We can't do it ourselves.
Yeah, that's real. Yeah, and I just affirm that, Craig. And I think, what resonated with me also, and what kind of hit some spots with me about what you were just expressing was, we have to really own the fact that as a society, as an American society, right, that we have all been racially programmed, right? And so when you're talking about changing the hearts and the minds, that's a thing, and let's just call it what it is, white supremacy, and my gentler term for that, right, and I think I've used this with you before, is, Caucasian culture, Caucasian culture supremacy mindsets, right? And that's just like, hey, you know, whiteness is the thing, and whiteness is the best, and you know, and our songs are the best, and you know, our clothes are the best, you know, and just really kind of owning that that's what's been sold, that's what people have been inundated with for generations. And so, as an organization, and what you're really striving to overcome is some of that's in people, and they're not even conscious that that's a thing, right? And so there's some of the struggle, and then we've got the multi-generational historic resentment on our side, right? Because it's there. I can't tell you how many times I've in our populations where it's like, no, I don't want nothing to do with that. I'm not going in there. You know, I mean, and we talk about that like one of the simplest representations I found of that is like a jury summons, right? So we know that in Washington State, there are, you know, there's just a ridiculous level of disproportionality as far as jury selection and representation for people of color, about people of color. It's just not there. It ain't happening, right? But yet it's real interesting to note that some of the things that I was taught as I was growing up was that you get those in the mail, toss it. You know, don't even look at it. You know, it's like, why? You know, so why do we want to engage with, you know, the big daddy culture that's harmed us? It's like, I don't want to play with you guys. I just want to survive it. You know, and so, you know, and there's some of that, and that, you know, and there's multiple levels of intersectionality and dynamics at play in that. You know, with those two kind of contrasts about that. You know, those are constantly stark. So we've got the Caucasian cultural supremacy mindset on one side, and then we've got the systemic trauma and resentment and generational on the other. And it's like, wow, is it really that hard to kind of try to figure out how we got here? Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of my friends made a comment as well, and he said, "Are we willing to heal? You know, are we willing to be healed?" Doesn't mean that you know everyone is in that position where they want to offer that healing, but when we do have entities that are saying, you know, we apologize for all the past tragedies and abuses and murders and homicides and lynchings and everything else that goes with that, and we apologize and we're working hard to change that, is the other side also willing to say, yes, we are willing to be healed? And it then becomes complicated, because then you get Minneapolis, then you get, you know, Tacoma, and you get all these other things, and everyone's like, well, see, you know, forget about it. You guys are just the same. You guys don't want to change. You say this, but you don't. And we're sitting there saying, whoa, time out. Yes, we do. Let's keep moving forward. Let's not give up because of this. The enemy wants to come, and the enemy wants to try to sabotage what we're doing. And so it's that adds a whole nother level of dimension when folks will then just say, we're done. We give up. And we're sitting there saying, don't give up on us.
Yeah.
Stay in the fight. Stay with us. We want to keep moving forward. So, but we're humans, and you know, the flesh is strong, and it's easy to revert back to you know what our human instincts are. I saw something you said, Kurtis, too. I saw an awesome picture. I'd seen it before of this story of this little girl. She's at the airport terminal, and just this nice gentleman. She climbs up on his lap and, you know, do you want to draw? And he's got a computer. He sits her down there, and she's drawing, and she doesn't say anything about it. And then she shows the picture, and it's this nice elderly gentleman, black male gentleman, sitting with this very white-haired little 3-year-old, you know, and the message is a lot of these things are learned. You're not born that way. You learn those through a number of different, you know, media, music, friends, parents, the full gamut. So. That's the other challenge too, is you have to be able to get people while they're younger as well, before they start forming their different ideologies.
Yeah, no, that's so real, right? And then, you know, also the expansive understanding and grasping of that truth. You know, the truth is that you know, these things were intentionally set in motion in this country. That it was controlled by certain factions. That there have been inundations of you know, extremists on so many different levels, and that the tactics that they've used that have, you know, because some of them have played the long game, right? Yeah. So, you know, so try to get them young, program them up, and using like basic stuff like here's some food, and hey, let's go to a movie, and here's some entertainment, and here's some music, and all the while throwing those messages, all the while that exposure. And so that's real just as far as the extremists, but there's also been a real subtle thing that's happened too, right? Is that when the TV shows that we watch, right? The real great movies, and who gave those the thumbs up and said they're great, right? And who poured all the money into those, and what was the casting like? The messages from that kind of stuff, right? Because the messages when I grew up, so it's just like the message for me with, I think I've told you the story, right? The Custer story. I tell you that one?
I don't remember that.
It's been a little bit. So yeah, when I grew up, Custer was a hero. He was the man. He was Glocks flowing and challenging and standing up for the savages. And whoa, his death was so terrible. Oh, what a shame. And it was only after I became an adult that I found out the truth. And so when we talk about what's occurring here in the United States, the generations that have been exposed to that kind of training, what they're exposed to currently. You add in all the layers of trauma and media influence, and whatever has happened individually and personally. It's real. God, man, how do you say it? It's just gut wrenching. Because that rocked my world. I had to work for a decade to even come to terms with the fact that I had been lied to all my life by a system I was predispositioned to try to trust. And that's just my generation. So the reality is that stuff is still in motion. Right? And so when we start looking at the impacts of that, and then start looking at the impacts of these of the challenges for law enforcement, the challenges internally, and the external ones, and the gravity of that weight, right, that you all are experiencing as human beings who have been trained the same way or worse, right? Wow, it's a and then you start adding in the layers of militarization, right? The layers of subduing human beings, tactics to be able to do that, and enforcement dynamics, and then you throw any kind of personal stuff in that along with all of those layers. It's like, is it really so hard to understand? We've got people behind the badge acting out, predominantly white people, but oh yeah, we've had some POC people act out too. That's a thing. That's where we're at. That's what this is about. That's some of the message behind that. And what are we going to do now? How are we going to do it? Undiscovered country. How do we get there together? Because no human being is disposable.
So if I could interject a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Kind of following up on what you just said. You both spoke about how change is going to be incremental, and there's nothing about it because it's a massive structural cultural change.
I would just want to catch that real quick. I said that's how it's occurred.
That's how it's occurring now, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So we seem to be faced with a protest movement that is fairly youth driven, and they seem to be in a hurry.
Yeah.
What do you both say to the people who are out there marching in the streets and agitating for change right now? No justice, no peace. What do you say to those folks we're working on it, but they don't want to hear we're working on it. They don't want to hear that patience is going to pay off. They want to know what you're doing now.
Yeah.
So what do you say to those folks?
So I would say we did not get here overnight.
Mm-hmm.
This has been hundreds of years getting to where we're at today. We are not going to get where all of us, let me back up, all reasonable people want to get. We're not going to get there overnight. It's going to take a while. When you see the destruction or the breaking glass or the looting or even the spray painting, I understand that in some of their mind they feel like that is an expression of my anger, but they need to also understand that is slowing down the process of us moving forward. So what happens is, at some point, we have to get to the point where we're sitting across from the table and talking to each other. So doing that, they don't have to do that in Spokane for us to sit across the table and talk to each other. That's the goal. Let's work through this together. Let's work through this collaboratively. And I think it was MLK who basically referenced, when you're seeing the riots, that's because they feel like they're not being heard.
Yep.
And my feeling here is, and I certainly am going to acknowledge it's not felt by all of the community of color, my feeling here is we do hear you, we have heard you, we are trying to make progress, we are working towards exactly what we all want. Don't give up on us. Don't let this distract us from what we've accomplished. I will acknowledge this is multiple steps backwards, but let's, at least with those people that we've worked with and we've been working with, let's at least acknowledge that we are trying to get better, and that is not going to get us sitting across the table more than what we are doing now. Come and be part of the solution and tell us, what is it that you're looking for that we're not doing, or what is it you're seeing that you don't want to see in Spokane. I control Spokane City. I don't control any other entity. So let's talk about this. Let's continue the progress we've already made in the city.
I would say, and I am saying, right? So, because I'm right there next to him, is you're right. You're absolutely right. And they have the right to feel that way, have the right to express it, have the right to be angry about it, frustrated, disheartened, discouraged, and really to not understand why some of these things are taking so long. Because the reality is that some of the reason it's taken so long is because there has been a structural resistance and interpersonal dynamic resistance between people within that structure against that change. And so, truth of the matter is, some of this stuff should move immediately and has been called to move immediately for a long time. The reality is some of it has moved incrementally. And thank God for the increments, right? Yeah, because even then, there's hope in that. But there's also that dynamic at play. Yeah, really what that means on so many different levels is that the only reason it's moving incrementally is because it's because of the personal and structural protectionism that supports the dynamics that we're sitting here talking about. And as a matter of fact, and I love this piece, right, Cargan, you and I talked about this too, right, is that some of the things at play is we are touting our disagreement with the philosophy of this injustice, right? But we're agreeing with the payoff, right? Because when we start really kind of getting an invitation to walk out this vocalized disagreement, we start encountering where we've been receiving and recipients of the benefit of the system that we're addressing. And there's the rub. There's that undiscovered country. There's that tweak zone, right? And so how do we, so first I just kind of want to articulate that, but absolutely, there are just some things, and I'm there, right? I'm there, it's like, no, stop killing us, period. Can we just start with that, okay, and have that be okay? It's not okay to put your knee on anybody's neck, black, brown, young, old, whatever, for any period of time, and especially from a organization that is, even if we just take where they're at right now, sworn to serve. No, you don't get to do that, and you don't get to keep your job afterwards. You don't get to turn around and get paid leave. You don't get to do any of those things. You are done, and now we're going to take a look at you from a restorative human lens. How did you get there? Right? Just like we're asking for those that have been generationally impacted and are dealing with, these sections of American society that have been intentionally divested in, right? And that's also a thing here in Spokane, in Spokane County, Spokane, Eastern Washington, right? It's been proven, redlining. We're doing trainings on that all the time now these days, right? Redlining happened. Redlining is still showing, and we see the impacts of that, the racial covenants. It wasn't that long ago. And do we really think that all of a sudden, all of the inertia that went into that, all of a sudden just got wiped away because we're all woke now? No. Now we have to undo the momentum that went behind that, and we do need to start now. And we do need some change right now. And the reality is some of it's going to take some time, because that's a big ship. That's a big wave. And so, I would just affirm it, but I would also affirm that the challenge of that is to those of our human family that are benefiting from the system, that know that it needs to change, but they're not willing to sacrifice their payoff for it. Right? Because there's social capital in it as well as physical capital. Like really, when we're talking to, so let's say we have this Caucasian male, prominent, and he says, yeah, you're right, that's terrible. And he feels it, right? He really means it, it's like, and we call it like from the neck up. He really feels it, right? And I mean it, and he really does mean it, and he just kind of hanging out in that zone of his consciousness until his meaning, it starts saying, well, you might have to, take a $200,000 home value cut, right? Oh, you mean it up to that point? There it is, right? So are we really willing to grapple with that? That's where we're at, and that's what it's going to take for some of this stuff to unravel, and then to be replaced with something better, and continue to view things system-wide, private, law enforcement, municipality, private industry, home ownership, life expectancy, COVID dynamics, structural and historic harms, everything with a high-level, intense race equity lens, and then measure the outcomes, and then continue to lean into that with the same intentionality and sustainability that has gone into creating that in the first place. Are we willing to do that? They're right to feel that way.
Can I step in?
Please.
I'm probably an average middle-class suburban guy, and I'm watching this.
You're above average in my eyes. Self-esteem.
Or two. There's, I think most people are familiar with the atrocities, people we've heard of, and incidents we've heard of. How can we look at what's going on now and say, here are some concrete goals that if we took this step, this step, this step, that would be movement? Because right now, a lot of people are just afraid of the rage in the streets, and will it lead to more riots and whatever. I guess, can we bring it down for people of color?
Yeah, and if I may, Craig, I'll take the first one.
Absolutely.
And just a couple of things too. So what it's going to take, and so for our Caucasian culture, right, for the dominant culture, what it's going to take is going to take some real commitment, right? Real commitment to make sure that as they're entering the voting booth, that they're not just voting the party line, they're voting the values that they're espousing. Yes, I stand for that, but then you vote for that guy. Yeah, and that guy, that's like the furthest thing off his mark, right? So that's that's a concrete thing, right? And so make sure that leveraging that privilege in that fashion. When that culture, and the reason I'm starting there is because I think it's obvious at this stage, POCs can't do it alone, right? We didn't get here alone, and we're not going to try to move forward alone, because last time I looked, we were all in this together. So my call out is to that right there. And with that, to make sure that as you're doing things like looking for loans or buying a vehicle or purchasing food, are you tapping into businesses, locally owned businesses, and if you're using a franchise, what's the race equity lens that franchise uses? What are its origins? How are their demographics? Basic things like that are some things that people can do on that side, as well as come on out here and join us, because hey, but when it comes to what we're really kind of facing here, in some of the immediate steps, we need I'm going to try to quantify it. We need people to show up in the places of power and hold the system accountable. right? Beyond these marches, right? So we're talking this is going to go back to the voting thing, but like we're getting some redistricting coming, right? With the Board of County Commissioners, right? Vote in a commissioner that matches your values. And, young people, get out and vote. Because there's that thing again, right? There's that thing. It's like, I don't want to play with it. I don't want to do it. Well, then by default, you're perpetuating it. You can come out here and march in the street, but if you're not going in and voting to match your march, then what's the point of the march? Oh, so you can go off? Don't we got enough of that? And doesn't it have that harm? I think one other thing would be to really demand transparency and accountability from our system as a whole, but definitely from our law enforcement community, to demand and hold accountable by being in these spaces and in these places, to make sure that when commissioner meetings are happening, there's community voices invitations, council invitations, open forums, that we're showing up there and we're asking questions, and then we're holding them accountable to their responses. This has to go beyond a march, or else the march is pointless. And basically it's the invitation for looters just to come on in, hijack it, and start the same nonsense all over again, which justifies some of the atrocities that law enforcement is already naturally challenged with, holding themselves back and dealing with a culture that's been in place for a long time. That's already a challenge, and then you add that stuff on top of it, and it's like, okay, powder keg, here we go, blow up, right back to normal again. So those are some basic steps. I know that the NAACP, the Spokane Community Against Racism, the Peace and Justice Action League, Smart Justice Spokane, the Asian Pacific Islander Coalition, the Hispanic Business Professionals Association, and many of our allies are all engaged in political action, implicit bias trainings, deconstructing historical racism trainings, and education across the system. So also getting involved in those as well, and coming in, it's like what's happening, and then I will actually pass. It's like what's happening with EWU, right? And they're taking out their diversity, equity, and inclusion office and provost and all that really? And everybody's just kind of going, so why aren't the students that are being impacted by this with their Caucasian allies marching into EWU? Why aren't we standing at the door of the directors and the powers that be behind that system saying, hey, what are you doing? No. So those are some kind of basic steps and some suggestions as well.
Thank you.
Don't know that I want to necessarily follow that. So you're asking what can we do right now? So it's when you're going to a group that is feeling harmed, I don't get to tell them what we're going to do. They have to tell me, here's what we need from you.
Yep.
And you have to be willing to listen. So the ability to move forward more quickly really has to do with listening, and listening to what it is they feel they need. So if I'm in a position of power and I want to improve relationships with somebody,
Yep.
you have to be willing to set that power to the side and say, let's talk about this.
That's what's up.
One of the things too, though, alluding back to what Kurtis has said as well, is being on both sides of the badge, is also saying, here's what I need. I need to do what the community wants me to do,
Right.
which is enforce laws, arrest people. I have to use force at times to arrest people who don't want to use force. So this is what I need to do. It's just a part of police work. We have to put that out there. Use of force, understandably, is a four-letter word in many circles. In law enforcement, it's a necessary evil that we have to do for people that don't want to go to jail, and it happens every single day to some extent. So that's coming and saying, here's what we need, because this is what the community expects of us, and you are part of the community, and you expect us to do that as well. You tell us, how do we work on this so that we all are working and moving forward in a way that we both like as well. One of the things I tell all of our new hires, I have a shtick for all of our new hires, and I tell them a couple things. I tell them specifically. One is, I'm a huge believer that to whom much is given, much is required. I think we're given a tremendous amount of authority. And so we hold ourselves to a higher standard. What that means is that whether you're on duty or off duty, we have a higher expectation than what you would necessarily get if you worked at a gas station or a grocery store or a bank. I also tell people that we use force because we have to, not because we can. There are many times where by policy or by law, you're justified to use force. The question you need to ask yourself is, do you have to use force? I would rather have an officer spend 15 minutes talking to someone that has to go to jail because of domestic violence or any number of other things than fighting them for 2 minutes. So if you are in a position where you can talk to them longer, that's what the goal is as well. So these are things where you're setting that precedent before you even hire them, and that's my spiel before they even get hired. And then I meet with them after the academy, 4.5 months of training, and we have the same conversation. And in services, the same conversations. So getting people to understand, and then when you do see, as an example, uses of force, you're reviewing those. Yep, this one was within policy, but you know what? Next time, wait for backup. This one's within policy, but you didn't necessarily do that. So you're within policy, but you're trying to help train them and guide them, and ideally get them to understand. Here's why you need to do what you do. So those are those things where it takes time to change that culture of how we view that. All while understanding our officers want to go home too, and they are frequently, daily, put in very dangerous situations. So we also need them to be safe as well. So there's this constant balancing of only using force that you have to use versus, yep, you deserve to go home as well. And we're human. We hire imperfect people, and sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes that mistake is more than just a mistake of the heart, it's a mistake of the head. It's like you've damaged us. You can no longer work with this agency, and that kind of stuff takes a while. And one of the things that I think helps, and this comes from relationships as well, though, is that you do have people like Kurtis last Sunday acknowledging there are bad cops. We don't like bad cops, but they're also willing to say these guys are not them. These guys are here for you. And Kurtis probably doesn't necessarily appreciate how much that means from our lens. But that is almost a sigh of relief for the officers that you are not lumping me with those officers in Minneapolis, and you're not saying that I am the one who did that, and you're acknowledging we're here to keep you safe. That gets officers to lower their guard as well, and that's where the best conversations occur.
Yeah, love that, Craig. And I really just kind of want to affirm that in the message of that, right? So if you notice the T-shirt that I got on, it says I did the time. So I'm a justice-involved individual from 1984 through 1987 for strong arm robbery, as well as a person of color. And it was real interesting when I got caught up in the criminal justice system. I hadn't received my racial training until then, right? And I mean, not at that distinct level. I came out, I went into doing my time as I'm just kind of I'm a mulatto, I'm mulatto. Woo, I'm mulatto. I came out of there black. And I'm good with that, right? The reality is I'm multiracial, right? Multi-ethnic. My father was half black, half native. My mom is Caucasian German Jew. And what I found in that system is that I received my racial title from the system. They didn't ask me, what are you? They told me what I was. That's what's up. That's what's going on. So as we're, kind of moving through this, it's important to understand, like you just unpacked, what's at play, the things that are in motion and have been in motion for such a long time, the real human struggle it is to come to terms that we've all been exposed to it. We've all been affected by it. We've all got work to do on that. And we're not going to do it in isolation. We're going to do it in community and coming together. And some of those coming together engagements are not going to be pretty, But it's been that comfort zone that's been created by the training of this oppressive system is the problem. It is the uncomfortability that we must now be comfortable with, because in that is going to be pointers and movement towards the solutions that have yet to be manifested and realized in this country, that are at the core pieces of our founding fathers for this nation. Justice, equality, freedom for all hasn't happened yet. So if we're in a place where we're comfortable and it hasn't happened yet, guess where the answer is? Right? It's in that uncomfortable zone. It's that way. And we can get there together. We have to. Because, you know, and I'll share this last piece with you. You know, I've also served as a firefighter for over a decade. And I've not met one wildland firefighter yet that doubts that climate change is real. They don't, because we see it, we live it. It's just like, hey, you know, you can see when somebody's strung out. You know, it's like, oh, I don't need to break out my manual and go, okay, is it the symptom? No, you know it. You're trained to understand that. So the reality is that you know, we're coming to an area in our evolution, in our time here as a species, as a planet, as a country, as a culture, human culture, to where we've got to come to terms with some things, and really understand that no one of us has all the answers, but together we can hopefully find the solution. Because if we don't, we are probably putting the welfare of our species as a whole at stake by not being willing to do so. How much of your privilege are you willing to sacrifice? How much of your social capital that your identity has been built on are you willing to challenge? How much of your resentment are you willing to let go of? We have a right to be all right.